I follow some like reactionaries. Like I know there's this guy Keith Woods, like another. He's like an Irish Nazi, like self declared Nazi, who I guess was close with Spencer. Was part of a publication with him. They've split. I guess he's become kind of a pariah even within white nationalist circles.
Spencer has.
Yeah, Spencer has. Yeah.
How come?
Well,
He's a
they
lib.
consider yeah they consider him kind of a
Too
lib
much of a
and
centrist.
they consider him kind of a lib and like cringe. Just his aesthetics and like his. I mean, he quite famously and I mean. Advocated voting for Biden in the last election because he thought that Kamala Harris and Biden would be better at jailing BLM activists or something like that. I mean, it was like, I mean, it's neither here nor
Wow,
there.
Kamala
Like,
does have forum on jailing people, so I mean,
oh
it's,
yeah,
it's
she's
not an outrageous reach.
no. I mean, he's again like I always like found it funny when people were like, oh, if you vote for Trump, like you're voting for Nazi. All the Nazis support Trump. It's like not true. Biden is quite loudly supported by Richard Spencer. Like,
Absolutely.
It did everyone a favor. Gave everyone a get out clause, I guess, on wherever you were being like harangued to vote for. Like, well, Richard Spencer's voting for Biden, so
yeah, I know. Like, yeah, I mean, and everybody was like, oh, but he's just trolling. It's just like, well, I don't know about that. I mean, his fellow, the Nazis who support Trump, like, take issue with him as a Nazi who supports Biden. So at least they take it seriously. So I don't know.
I can imagine him penning an article in some magazine called, and why not Biden?
Why not Biden?
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to BungaCast. It's Saturday, the 22nd of January when we're recording this. I'm Alex Hochuli, joined as usual by Philip Cunliffe. George Hoare is away, but we'll struggle on without him and without his puns because we're joined today by Ross Wolfe. Ross is a Marxist writer and architecture critic in New York. I think he'll be familiar to many of you, especially online leftists. I guess you're listening to a podcast, so by default, you'll be an online leftist. I don't know. He had a popular blog called The Charnel House, focused on the history of revolutionary architecture and politics, and is also associated with the hashtag Doom. And make of that what you will. I don't know if he was the originator of that. Yeah.
Did you actually originate the Doom hashtag, Ross?
I don't know. I certainly used it quite a lot.
Or maybe the Doom hashtag originated you.
I think it maybe, if anything, it just captured a sort of cultural zeitgeist. So I don't claim to
which continues, which I know most definitely.
It's
continues.
never ending.
It's true.
Never
yeah.
ending.
Anyway, we're very belatedly having Ross on. It's very nice to have you on, Ross. To talk about, a range of things. We're going to talk a little bit about your own political history, a bit about architecture, and then we're going to delve into a really brilliant essay that you've written on justice, or really arguing against justice and laying the argument out for why Marxists should be very skeptical or abandon any notion of an egalitarian ideology or ideology founded on justice. So we're going to get into that in just a second.
But we wanted, I guess, to give a bit of context before we get into the Marxism Contra Justice essay that you wrote. And I know you've written you wrote a short biographical essay in your blog some time ago covering your political development. And we're wondering maybe if you could tell us a little bit more about that. What's your political background and how did you come to the political views you hold today? And when did you start thinking of yourself as a Marxist?
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you for having me on the program. I don't listen to many podcasts really, except Come Town, which my girlfriend listens to constantly. So I'm a bit.
I mean, we can call each other gay and say that you suck dicks and whatever if that makes you more comfortable.
Yeah, I mean, maybe. But in any case, yeah, Antifada had me on a couple times to talk about things I'd written. But I like a lot of the guests you've had that BungaCast has invited on. You've had on Alex Gunler and Anton Yeager to talk, and I really admire the work of Aaron Benenov. with whom you also did an episode. Um, Plus, I really enjoyed Philip's book, Lenin Lives, which is an alternate history of the Russian Revolution. Yeah, so it's great to be on to talk. Like you said, some people know me from my blog, which I don't really update as often as I used to. Really, these days I'm mostly working, hanging out, watching sports and stuff. So I don't really, post as frequently as in the past. So most of the stuff
that means your life has improved since you stopped blogging.
Oh yeah, I mean it's just, I don't know. I know work, it's a means to an end as it is for everyone. But yeah, I mean most of the stuff that I write now, like it's for outside publications, some of which are better known, others are pretty obscure. So over the last few years, like I've had essays, articles, reviews, interviews published in the Brooklyn Rail, Insurgent Notes, Cured Quail, Situations, Rethinking Marxism, Mediations, Data Side, which is the one you guys contacted me about, and of course the Platypus Review. Some of the architecture stuff, I guess we'll talk about a little bit about, has been featured in the Architect's newspaper, Metropolis Mag, Eflux, and this Swiss journal Archithes. Also, like briefly, I contributed to and helped edit this left communist organ called Intransigence. Published some criticisms of AOC and just social democratic leftism. But in any case,
but we'll include links. We'll include links to this, and listeners, if they're not familiar with Charnel House, they should still check it out, even if it's not being updated so regularly, because it's really a brilliant resource. I mean, I used to be a very regular visitor to it, and then I realized actually in advanced recording, it's like, man, it's been a while. It's been like maybe a year since I visited it, but I used to be such a regular visitor to it and reading about things which I barely understood but found really interesting. So
and very, very, very aesthetically pleasing, unlike many blogs. And that was always appreciated. I certainly appreciated about it. So when did you start contributing to these online forums, magazines, and so on?
Oh, so all right. So yeah, you asked earlier about my political and intellectual history, and really, it's been somewhat constant. I think like I haven't actually changed my views too radically, over the, decade plus that I've been involved and interested in all this stuff. But it's moved through a few different phases. So really, I was always interested in the history of the Russian Revolution, really from the time I was a teenager in the early aughts, mostly sympathizing with Trotsky against the sort of Stalinist degeneration of the revolution. But what really politicized me was the Iraq War, as I came into contact with a bunch of sort of soft front trot orgs in the anti-war movement.
Just if I could, so the point about Trotsky and Stalin, so you picked this up out of historical interest, or there is a family background? Was it from what you were taught in school, or did you pick it up online? How did it emerge?
Yeah, kind of a family background. My family is Russian Jewish. They moved prior to the October Revolution, but my great grandfather was a Bundist, which is like a Jewish socialist organization, condemned by Trotsky and Lenin as kind of culturally chauvinistic or nationalist. But to be contrasted, it's often contrasted with Zionism. He, I guess, would pamphlet synagogues. He was very secular. But from what I understand, like he became intensely sympathetic with Stalin when he moved to the United States, mostly because, and a defender of Stalin, mostly because he just liked the fact that the communists had killed the czars, and he remembered persecution from that time. So yeah, I guess, for whatever reason, I just, because of my family's history, I became interested in the Russian Revolution, that sequence, and just reading books about it. I read Sheila Fitzpatrick. I read Richard Pipes, of all people, when I was 14 or 15 years old, and just became interested in that. And then a couple of years later, the Iraq War started. And I was intensely opposed to that. I thought it was complete bullshit from the jump, and began getting involved in the sort of activist left milieu that sprouted up really like almost pathologically anti-Bush. Like, I mean, that became a huge problem as it sort of, became just, especially, even the Trotskyist organizations totally capitulated to Obama. Like by 2007, as like, the whole thing they were saying stuff like, oh, we can't go on record as opposed to the first black president or whatever. So they ran a lot of ideological cover for Obama and the Democratic Party, and that's something that has happened repeatedly in terms of the left. It just fixates on whatever right-wing boogeyman exists in the present and uses that as justification to back the lesser evil, which they think of as the Democrats invariably.
And so was it this, so the capitulation, as you say, to Obama, that is what alienated you from the kind of the radical left fringe?
Certainly the activist left. And I mean, around that time, in terms of my college studies, I started reading a lot of German idealist philosophy in the mid-aughts and critical theory, which really takes up the legacy of German idealism, Hegel and Kant, and filters that through a Marxist lens and applies that lens to the history of Marxism itself. So really politically combining sort of vaguely Trotsky's sympathies with more intellectual curiosity in terms of the Frankfurt School, which sort of led me in early grad school, to the Platypus Affiliated Society, which I was a member of for a few years. I'm still, I'm interested.
Platypus adjacent?
I wouldn't call myself platypus adjacent. I find some of the antics and rhetoric of some of their members quite irritating online. But they're more serious published work. Some of it that Catrone does, some of it that their other members do is kind of interesting. And their publication, it's a forum, right? Like it includes outside contributions. And some of that I find quite good. John Garvey from Insurgent Notes has published there. Alan Milkman, the late Alan Milkman from Internationalist Perspective. So they publish a range of stuff. Jamie Merchant has been part of fora panels that they've done. And the work by their own members is occasionally interesting to me as well. And their project, while intriguing, their whole focus is on the death of the left and whatnot, and exploring the consequences of that. I found really, toward the end of my time in Platypus, that really they don't really have a monopoly on the insight into the sort of the death of the left, if you will, or just the problems that the pathological forms that leftism take today. And I became more intrigued by left communist politics and theory around this time. So around like 2013, 2014. So
and what was the difference between left communism and the Trotskyist activism that you were leaving behind?
So I was really prepped for the left communist critique by some of Adorno's writings in the 1960s, his critique of actionism, which grew out of his confrontation with the student left during that time in Germany. I found that an Italian Marxist, Amedeo Bordiga, had written a critique of activism from more within the political tradition of Marxism, the organized political tradition of Marxism. Adorno never belonged to any parties to speak of. But beyond that, intellectually, I was sympathetic to the anti-nationalism of the sort of modern left communist synthesis, which combines sort of Dutch-German currents with the Italian Bordigist current. I'm sympathetic more to Onorato Dahmen, who was a disciple of Bordiga, who moved away from him in the 50s, really. but in any case, I've maintained an interest in critical theory, and more recently, the new reading of Marx that has emerged in German circles. I studied with Moishe Pistone at Chicago, so I was very receptive to that line of thinking, and the anti-nationalism of it, and the criticisms of some of the pathological forms of leftism that Platypus sought to address. I find left communism does as well, perhaps, in my opinion, better. But in any case, that's where I mean, in terms of my like concrete positions on any number of issues, like I don't think they've really changed too much. I mean, really, except like my disillusionment with the anti-war left was palpable. But I was never a supporter of the Sanders thing. Like the DSA was always, to me, just nothing that I was ever interested in. I've never voted. I would certainly never vote for a Democrat. I think that that's just a complete abandonment of Marxist principle to support any bourgeois party. And yeah, I found a lot of the sort of resurgence of Marxism around Sanders and even post 2008 to be kind of, I don't know, unserious. But it is what it is.
I wanted to, just listening to you talk, it takes me back a bit, because something that I still haven't quite got my head around is that, but I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on it, is that there really was kind of a remarkable efflorescence of Marxist theorizing in that period. And the fact that people, that these, post-war, post-First World War debates on Dutch council communism, anti-nationalism, like you say, the rediscovery of Bordiga, whom only really Lauren Goldner, kind of had done anything really to kind of pay attention to. And you had a few footnotes here and there in some of the more well-known texts. But then suddenly, like my students, the students I was teaching who were leftists of various kinds, they knew about Bordiga, at least the more radical involved ones. Oh, yeah, absolutely. And also, Bordiga memes were popping up. I mean, this is just an example with Bordiga particularly, but it's only to say that there was a remarkable kind of efflorescence of, all sorts of obscure aspects of 20th century Marxist history and politics that seemed to explode, or at least, there was a remarkable kind of growth and in discussion. And a lot of it was online. And like I say, then it kind of took all of the typical kind of online forms with various kind of Facebook discussion groups. And obviously there was the Aftermath discussion group, of which I think we're all members. You're a member too, Alex, right? The secret discussion group that was outed in the interview with what's his face.
Michael Rectenwald.
Yeah, Michael Rectenwald. Yeah. So I suppose, I mean, I don't know if that was specifically connected to the internet, that there was this ability to kind of share obscure text that would have been very difficult to get hold of, or whether there was something more to it, whether there was a sociology and a politics to it. Perhaps you got some more insight, but I'd be curious to hear, because I was very struck by it, and it still seems to me important in terms of shaping the trajectory of many people on either the activist left or the intellectual left at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure what led to the sort of upsurge in interest in these currents, Bordiga or Dutch, German council communism. Part of it probably is the easier access to these texts that just comes through the internet. Various, very marginal groupings. I'm probably most sympathetic to, I would maybe think of myself as a fellow traveler, to the International Communist Tendency, or ICT, who's, very unaesthetically pleasing blogs and websites, the degenerated workers' sites of left communism became available and shareable through the internet. But I probably also spoke to, I mean, if we're being honest, like, there are various efforts to sort of like, retread, revolutionary history and think of like, where did it all go wrong? the left communists have one version of this. Trotskyists have another version. The Stalinists and Maoists have different versions. The Hojists have their own version. Lauren Goldner says, about how, basically you could infer from when somebody dates the end of the Russian Revolution, their positions on a whole constellation of related political issues. If you think it ended in 1953, if you think it ended in 1939, 1923, 1927, whatever it is. But I mean, I think that there must have been something somewhat compelling. I mean, it brought together, groups from Italy, the ICT's affiliates there, various ultra lefts in France. There are, for whatever reason, a bunch of people from former Yugoslavia who were interested in left communism, people from Britain. It brought together people from, probably not that numerous. I mean, if we're talking the aggregate, like just a few hundred. But it certainly has been a fertile ground for intellectual discussion, for theorizing. However much like tides may have shifted in terms of like latching onto, these populist left movements, Syriza, Podemos, figures like Sanders or Corbyn.
Yeah.
You got people who were just like, oh, forget all this like lofty theorizing, this is what's attainable in the present, and we've got to get behind it. I've never been sympathetic to any of that, but I can sort of understand.
Did you find those people that you knew in those circles were there? I mean, certainly I had a handful of left communist kind of adjacent students, and they did all seem to be dragged along in the wake of Corbyn.
Yeah, I mean, it was surprising to me to see some of the people just really, in my view, perhaps dogmatic view, they were all abandoning their principles in order to just get behind what seemed, it was feasible, or, goals that could be reached. My line was always that, someone like Sanders, he belongs to a bourgeois party, the Democratic Party, the graveyard of all social movements, as it was known in the past. Why the hell would a communist ever support, a reformist like this? Or Corbyn, I guess, who had somewhat more radical credentials, I guess, in Britain. I can understand it. People want to, get behind something that they feel like has a shot of working out. But even like, to me, like, it was always like, okay, let's assume that Corbyn somehow, wins the general election, or let's say that, Sanders somehow miraculously wins the Democratic primaries, like, and they get elected into office.
Yeah.
Somehow, what then? Like, I mean, do you really think that they would not immediately betray even the modest, promises of reform that they've made when holding the reins of power? Even like the faintest whiff of like inflation or, or economic crisis would lead them to basically legislate austerity in the same way that Mitterrand did in the 80s. Like, after riding a wave of popular socialist and communist support to the presidency of France, like, I don't view political figures as really determining these things, like, especially when they reach office through electoral avenues. Like,
I think that's the big difference between Corbyn, Sanders, and Mitterrand, is that Mitterrand at least waited until he was in power to betray the hopes of the left, whereas Sanders and Corbyn succeeded in betraying those hopes before they even got close. So
they're still just dutifully remaining within these bourgeois parties and saying, oh, vote Hillary or vote Biden or whatever. And Corbyn, I guess he's, is he actually going to go through with this new party thing? Like, I've heard it talked about.
Yeah, I've not been paying very close attention to it. So for our listeners who haven't been following it, Corbyn has had the whip removed from him from a while now, which is to say he's sitting in the Houses of Parliament as an independent rather than as a member of the Labour Party. He was expelled by the current Labour leader, Keir Starmer, it's connected to all the allegations of anti-Semitism and so on. And so there's now rumours that he might set up, not only sit as an independent, but might set up his own party. I find it hard to believe, I think because I mean, who knows what might come of it? But certainly on the left, I mean, there's George Galloway, the old Scottish kind of Stalinoid Labour Party member, ex-Labour Party member, who was always spinning off kind of new workers' parties. And I find it hard to believe Corbyn would, because for all of his rebelliousness on the backbenches, he was a die-hard, committed member of the Labour Party. The idea that he would break with them, I don't find credible. And especially given that, many more figures who were in much stronger political positions and had much more to gain from breaking with the Labour Party didn't break with the Labour Party. And I'm talking of people I know kind of more directly here. So I don't think Corbyn would, but who knows? I mean, maybe his twilight years have a final act.
And this might actually be a decent segue into the essay, because from what I've read, like the party that he would be founding is called the Peace and Justice Party.
Perfect. That's the most bullshit name you could possibly imagine. It's perfect. And it's absolutely even better because it's denuded of any kind of reference to the workers, unlike George Galloway. Brilliant. Mm-hmm. Just before we get on to that, then, I just wanted to just to get you to expand a bit more on the political content of the anti-nationalist currents that you mentioned, and what the appeal is, or what you think their strength is in terms of left politics, Marxist politics.
Well, historically, the question of Marxism has always thought of itself as an internationalist project, and even the forms of national liberation that various, quite famous and revolutionary leaders of Marxism have proposed to support, really were in the context of a sort of generalized world revolution. I'm thinking of like Lenin and whatnot, but even he faced criticism from within his own ranks. It was not a settled matter. From Trotsky early on, from Bukharin and Luxembourg in Germany, and then later the various Dutch-German currents who thought that, especially outside of the context of a sort of larger world revolution, that would mean, revolution in the advanced capitalist core, the most advanced industrially countries around the world, that various projects of national liberation really, perhaps throwing off the shackles of colonial oppression, which is never a bad thing, really were not going to be a vehicle to any wider socialist internationalist revolution, and really would end up only reproducing the antagonism between the national bourgeoisie and the international proletariat in each of these countries. I've found myself, I imagine this is probably where I might disagree with you guys somewhat, because I'm skeptical. I'm completely skeptical of the EU, but I'm also skeptical of Brexit. I don't see national sovereignty as really a lever that can be used against sort of the world markets, or the pressures of the world markets to sort of shelter national economies or benefit the working class in any sort of long-term way. I think for me, really, the promise of internationalist Marxism is that the dictatorship of the proletariat cannot really be conceived in terms of any present-day boundaries. Like, it would inevitably, its core would be wherever it takes place in the most advanced industrial sectors of the economy worldwide, whether that would be Berlin or London or Paris or Washington, D.C., wherever it would be. It really would not map onto any of the existing political entities. And it would, of course, face, unless, and I'm like, really, you got into this was the fear of the revolutionaries in the First World War, was that if the revolution remains isolated or is contained to a single country, especially a relatively backwards one, it would inevitably be encircled, which is what was historically borne out with the USSR. I think really the only threat to world capitalism, in terms of threatening to move on to a higher stage of social organization, came with the First World War. That was really the big opportunity. I don't think that it's impossible, even if it might seem unlikely, that conditions might be reproduced where the sort of progressive overcoming of capitalism on a world scale is possible. But I find these sort of nationalist deviations or backing of various perhaps oppressed nationalities as really a viable route towards achieving communism on a sort of world scale. So that's really, for me, the promise of left communism, because it is so intransigently internationalist and opposed to all nationalist projects.
But isn't it in itself, I mean, I suppose without getting into the weeds of Brexit, but I suppose doesn't it speak also, this is, I suppose, what always struck me about the, which is why, I mean, partly why I'm intrigued to hear an American talk about it, because it seemed to me, at least in the European context, it was a way for a certain group, and I don't mean in the aftermath of the First World War, I mean now, the people now who are drawn to it, to kind of distance themselves from their own national politics. That it was an expression in a way of their own alienation from politics as such, and it offered kind of a refuge, an online refuge from national politics, particularly in the context of the European Union, and particularly in the context of all the kind of national problems that came in the wake of the sovereign debt crisis and so on. But I think that's a different situation in the States. So I suppose I'm curious as to, given the fact that there isn't kind of that legacy and history of the way in which international continental rivalries stymie all sorts of international solidarity or all sorts of political progress in the national context. Is there anything else about it from the American context that drew you? Because it seems to me something which is very European in many ways, and that it speaks to its origins in a particularly kind of conflictual era of geopolitical rivalry that in many ways is gone. I mean, it doesn't exist in the same way, at least in Europe.
I would agree that in Europe, I mean, a lot of the people who online came to cluster around and find sort of an intellectual home or a theoretical home in left communism, they often came from places like Germany, Italy, that have had troubling nationalist pasts. Former Yugoslavia, which obviously in the 90s had a total bloodbath in terms of ethno-nationalist rivalries. In the United States, I think, I mean, some of the people who have found left communism appealing just have been they've repeatedly come into contact with various Maoist organizations for whom really internationalist politics means backing whatever various anti-imperialist powers seem to be on the stage and rooting for, I don't know, could be Maduro, Chavez, Castro, even modern day China as sort of challenging US hegemony and backing, whatever regime has been put into place there, simply because of its anti-American credentials or posturing. And so for them, really, their pseudo-internationalism just means rooting for the national bourgeoisie of a country opposed to their own. Yeah. And for me, that I've always found that just to be a total dead end. Especially because, I mean, I guess for Maoists, especially third worldists, they believe that a revolution in the imperial core is impossible, or just so unlikely as to, just never occur. For me, perhaps my old Trotskyist sympathies, and I think this is shared by left communism, believing that world revolution has to occur as a sort of coordinated effort in the most advanced industrial countries. You can't, rooting for the national bourgeoisies or bourgeois governments of governments that happen to be geopolitically opposed to the interests of the United States, really doesn't promise anything for like a future socialist order or
No, indeed.
communism. So for me, that was really part of it.
Yeah. And that makes sense. And I suppose it spurs a second thought, which is that one thing that struck me about Platypus, and I don't know if this was your experience as well, and this is obviously from the outside because I'm not a member of Platypus, but it seemed to me to also be a way in which many kind of young leftists who might have been repulsed by the anti-Americanism of the American left, for a way for them to reconcile themselves to America itself, in a way, through the American revolutionary tradition and the legacy of the American Revolution, which I know all the Plats kind of venerate and even I'd say idolize. I mean, to some degree with justice. I think also it's excessive in some way, that there might be an effective kind of online life and online debates. But I wondered if that was also part of your kind of the appeal of Platypus to you, and the appeal of Platypus on the left itself, that it allows leftists to be patriotic in a sense in America in a way that they wouldn't be able to if they were affiliated with other parts of the American left.
Well, I mean, personally, I never really had an interest in American patriotism. I find flag waving of any sort, except for perhaps the red flag, to be just, something that's opposed to Marxist internationalism. But that being said, I found a lot of the sort of fetishized anti-Americanism of the American left and even the international left to be something that was equally devoid of promise. And I think and this was in part the influence of Moishe Postone, who had influence over a lot of various German Marxists, but also Platypus. But it's something also that's there in classical revolutionary Marxism. Like if you read Marx's own appraisal of the American Revolution, even in like the preface to Capital, he referred to the 1776 Independence War as the tocsin for, the bourgeoisies of Europe to sort of rise up and cast off the ancien regime. And then the American Civil War as the tocsin for the working class of Europe to throw off capitalism. And then even Lenin, like writing letters to the working class of the United States, saying like, look back at your own revolution, your country's revolutionary tradition. There have been, anti-feudal, elements to your country's history, and quite progressive episodes from your country's history that you can proudly draw upon. I don't think that involves like being pro-America or anything like that. I don't think that being pro any capitalist countries in any way, I mean, at least in the era of international working class revolution, is in any sense promising or opens a vista onto like a world communism. But that is perhaps some of the appeal that it had. I don't know. I again, like, talking about, that's something that even like Jacobin and stuff, like they're very into Lincoln and stuff, like Marx's, support of Lincoln in the Civil War, which of course is, something I think any Marxist, should understand,
Yeah, of course.
So, I mean, some of these questions about, where you position yourself in concrete struggles and concrete politics today might be something we want to return to in a bit, but only after we've discussed your essay, which is really brilliant. I encourage listeners to go and read it in full. It's Marxism Contra Justice in Dataside magazine. Before we actually get into the content, Ross, why don't you tell us what Dataside magazine is? Because I wasn't familiar with it.
Yeah, so I was really pleased that you guys contacted me about this essay, because as I mentioned, like, it really didn't receive too much fanfare when it came out. And part of it probably has to do with the journal where it appeared. Dataside, it's a mostly German English publication that focuses on, of all things, Marx's value theory and underground electronic music.
Quite a combination.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite obscure. but it's aesthetically quite well done. I guess the German guy who runs it has a record label. He, a lot of cutting edge like techno acts have he's recorded with them, but it's an unusual combination. And the site was post blocked from Facebook, probably because of its title, data site. They probably thought it was some sort of like hacker site gathering users' information, but for whatever reason, you couldn't post links to it on Facebook for like over a year. So sharing it, a few people shared it on Twitter, I guess. Lauren Goldner contacted me to say that he'd read it. Matt Bolton and Frederick Harry Pitts, who I guess are British Marxists, value form thinkers, also read it and appreciated it, I guess. But in general, like really people have not discussed it much. So I'm really glad to be able to talk about it. I think it's, as I go into in the article, like, it's the identification of Marxism with some sort of doctrine of justice or some sort of egalitarian ideology is quite old. It goes back to the 19th century even, but it's something that's recurred, especially with this focus on so-called social justice today. So I'm glad to talk about it.
So I mean, as a way of maybe going through the main arguments in the essay, and it also presents a kind of long kind of sort of intellectual history of approaches to justice, even before Marx, which is worth reading on in its own right. But as concerns the main Marxian, or specifically Marxism and Marx and Engels' contention against justice and against sort of an egalitarian conception of socialism. As a way of going through that, what were the kinds of issues that you thought suffered from being formulated as problems of justice today? Like, who are you writing this against, I guess, to put it that way?
Well, I mean, it was kind of interesting because, like, I found in surveying, various supposed Marxists on the left, as well as anti-Marxists on the right, they both tended to share this view of Marxism as a doctrine of justice, as a doctrine of social justice, specifically. And this ranged on the left from various Trotskyist organs. You could tell, I mean, the essay was published in January 2020, so a couple months before the pandemic. But it was written in 2017, 2018. It took just a while to get published. And so I was reading like the now defunct ISO's journal, one of their editors, as well as Alain Badiou, a French Maoist, both seem to think of Marxism as somehow, some form of egalitarian view of the world, founded on a principle of social justice. At the same time, I was reading like various like far right, even white nationalist journals that were extremely anti-communist, extremely anti-Marxist. Certainly, I was reading Richard Spencer's Radix journal. Rootedness is a big concept for white nationalists, but they both thought of the roots of modern social justice ideology as the intellectual forefathers of this to be Marxists and Marxism as a worldview. Interestingly, I found that
I guess this is associated, I suppose, with the general right-wing understanding of cultural Marxism and seeing contemporary identity politics, social justice, wokeness, and so on as having, in some sense, Marxist roots. That's a similar sort of misapprehension on their part, right?
Yeah, so that's the interesting thing. It's like both the sort of proponents and opponents of Marxism, the self-declared proponents of Marxism, and their opponents seem to share this conception of Marxism as a sort of idea of social justice, as a way to bring about justice in the world. And I found that whether or not their appraisals or evaluations were positive or negative, they both shared this fundamental view. But this ran contrary to Marx and Engels' own stated positions, and as well as the positions of many of, in my opinion, their best adherents. So figures like Rosa Luxemburg, figures like Paul Lafargue in the French Party, as well as some of the debates that later occurred in the 1970s between analytic Marxists and some of their continental critics, Daniel Ben Said, Sean Sayers. We can go into that a bit further, but I just found it interesting, this sort of misconception. They totally misconstrued the theoretical and practical premises of Marxism by thinking of it as this sort of like idea of justice.
So can you maybe just briefly spell out what that is? I mean, what the kind of how the materialist understanding is distinguished from one rooted in a notion of justice or in equality, just so that we can then get that under our belts, and then we can move on to discuss some of the kind of finer grained detail.
Sure. So, I mean, in terms of the sort of long history of the concept of justice, like really from the times of ancient philosophy, ancient Greek philosophy, justice has been sort of the centerpiece. It was always the most important concept for Plato. It was high up there for Aristotle. And there was always this idea of it being the doctrine of suum cuique, the idea you give to each their due. In the past, with Aristotle, certainly, with different forms of government, democracies were more egalitarian, oligarchies more hierarchical. The idea was that you grant what is due to them. Like if they're great, they deserve a lot. If they're not so great, they don't deserve that much. So it could have any number of more hierarchical or egalitarian iterations. As you moved to the more modern conceptions of justice, because as a materialist, I view philosophers' sort of self-understandings as mirroring social relations. The concepts of justice they tended to mirror property relations and this idea of exchangeability, interchangeability, equivalence, which is where the idea of equality before the law, for Marxists really derives. So because of the emergence of modern social relations of production, capitalism, where one person's labor time is equivalent to another's based on the social average, the idea of social equality before the law became this sort of ideological reflection of this sort of underlying material reality. And so conceptions of justice, so the sort of blind justice, like weighing the scales, in a jury of peers or whatnot, really, and all the modern juridical relations that developed in bourgeois society, really, reflect this underlying social reality of material relations, the exchange of commodities, and whatnot. And the conception of justice as teach their due, and everybody should be given equally. Really, it's a product of society. It's an ideological artifact of bourgeois society, and it can't be the basis then for the critique of that society. It's fundamentally Marxist point, because conceptions of justice vary historically and are the outcome of these relations. They can't then serve as a critique or the grounds for a critique of these relations.
So for Marx, the claim that, for example, I don't earn enough and that someone's making money off my back and that I should earn more, that would be more fair, or that some people don't have the same means as other people do. That claim about justice is something which, if not being wrong, it's something that's inimical to his vision. Would that be a way you'd agree? Would you agree with that statement?
Yeah, and he's quite explicit about this, and which is why, it's interesting because many supposed adherents to Marxism think of themselves as think of Marx as having at least an implicit sense in which he thought that capitalist society was unjust, even though he explicitly disavowed this on numerous occasions. His whole idea was that it's not a question of fairness. It's not a question of a fair day's wage for a fair day's work. He really militated quite strongly against that slogan, the Chartist slogan. For him, really, the conception of justice that obtains in any given society is adequate to the underlying social relations, and it's shared by significantly both workers and capitalists. I mean, this really goes along with what is it in the German ideology, where he says that the ruling ideas of any age are those of the ruling class. So the bourgeois conception of justice, the idea that people deserve what they get, really, is a reflection of bourgeois social relations. And that really, even though one might think of exploitation as a sort of inherently judgmental category, saying that it's an unjust, unequal relation, he's emphatic in Capital, I mean, really from the 1840s through the 1870s, that the worker is not cheated, really. That the idea is that they confront each other, at least formally, as equals on the market when the capitalist is procuring the labor time, the labor power of the worker. That the worker is not thereby cheated, even though they work over and above the value of their labor. They confront each other, they reach an agreement as equals, and this is the conception of justice that they themselves share.
Yeah, that it's fair according to those rules of the game. But of course, some socialists, in fact, many throughout history, have sought to say, well, no, there's some different standard of justice. There's a different basis for it that we should argue for, that justice should be based on some other notion, and we can go into what those might be. I think, though, what you find in the wild, I mean, even today, is that there's arguments for fairness, but I think most radical leftists would dismiss those as well. They would be supposedly in line with your argument and also saying, this fairness thing is nonsense. There's no real grounding to this idea of fairness. But what they would then advocate in its place is a much more radical equality, I suppose, right? And your argument and your kind of defense of Marx here is based on an idea that it's not just that notions of fairness should be abandoned, but notions even of equality, that some sort of egalitarian vision or egalitarian ethos should also be abandoned in the name of the building of a new free society. So maybe you could explain that. What is the problem with equality? Because I think most people would hear this and say, well, okay, but surely capitalism doesn't proffer equality. It proffers formal equality, but not any substantive equality. So how is Marx against this substantive equality?
Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting. Like often you hear in sort of HR style speak, people talk about, well, it's more about equity than it is about equality, whatever that means.
Right.
So equity being a stand-in for sort of material equality. But I mean, really, like Marx is quite consistent on this throughout his entire career, throughout his entire body of writings, from his polemics against Proudhon in the 1840s and Heinzen in the 1840s, up through the 1870s, his critique of the Gotha program, the writings against Hochberg, and Engels' polemic against Dühring. That really, the idea of egalitarianism, the sort of equal, giving out to those equally, this idea that really they associate with Proudhon and his idea of justice éternelle, or eternal justice. Like the idea that of giving rights to people, and really, again, for him, Gerechtigkeit, the German word for justice, is rooted in this idea of Recht, or right. He talks in the critique of the Gotha program about how equal rights are always a right to inequality, and this idea that it's not an idea of giving equally to different people because people's needs are unequal. Really, for Marx, the idea is that it's for the universal provision of need, the universality of need, rather than people's equal right to the proceeds of social labor. It's not about redistribution, because for most of the socialists of the 19th century, essentially that's what it was. It wasn't about changing the material relations of production. It was more about just redistributing the proceeds of that relation of production more equally, giving equally to everybody. but a blind person has different needs than a person with functional vision. So for him, the idea of equality, this sort of abstract equality that that was proclaimed by various bourgeois philosophers, while very revolutionary in its sense for its time, as a sort of way to cast off the sort of great chain of being, the sort of hierarchy of the cosmos that feudal society had upheld, while that sort of natural rights view of all human beings are created equal was quite progressive for its time. The kind of society that would be created historically through proletarian revolution would be not one that's based on the abstract equality of individuals, but rather through the fact that they all have needs that must be met through social production.
So I suppose two thoughts occurred to me listening. I had a different question in mind, but another question has emerged listening. When Marx formulated when he, at least, like you say, the polemics and the various kind of arguments he was involved in over that period, like you say, most of them were directed against ideas associated of labor money and redistribution, and the idea that there was some kind of raw deal that workers were getting, which is what explained their impoverishment and general exploitation. And that's slightly different from the way in which, so most of the debates about justice on the left today, what strikes me, apart from debates around reparations, the form that debates on the left take today around justice are often cultural or symbolic. So, they very rarely even, I suppose there's, there's the kind of gender pay gap and racial pay gap and reparations. But aside from that, the overwhelming kind of, if we talk about social justice struggles, usually it's with reference to historical wrongs, to, education, to cultural symbols, obviously, whether statues should be up there, what curriculums should teach, what these kinds of things. And so today, those debates about justice really even seem to, they don't even seem to cut as deeply into basic questions of material questions of distribution and production, even to the superficial extent that those Proudhonian kind of claims of the 19th century did.
Yeah, I would agree with that judgment. Yeah, I mean, some of the historical grievances that are mentioned in left circles today really, while some of them might say like, well, we do want material reparations in some sense, largely it does remain on the sort of, in my opinion, superficial symbolic level of just wanting recognition or acknowledgement in some sense, rather than, but even like granting, if one were to talk about, and this is a much more concrete way of perhaps spelling out what I was getting at earlier, the idea of like eliminating the racial pay gap or the gender pay gap, let's assume that takes place for him. And so everyone is, fairly paid. Yeah. That would just be the right to be exploited equally by capital for Marx. Yes. If you're not doing away with the wage system, you're just, but removing the various accidental, one might argue, accidental features of inequality that persist within the wage relation, which are filtered through one's race or one's gender or whatnot, one's sexual orientation, however if that affects the pay that they receive. The idea for Marx is not to just make it more equitable in terms of like everybody gets paid equally. The idea is to move beyond the wage relationship itself. Yeah, which is his very concrete critique of the Chartist slogan, "A fair day's work for a fair day's pay." He said, we've got to move away from this conservative motto to the revolutionary motto of abolition of the wage system.
Yeah. And so it strikes me that these demands for, say, abolishing various pay gaps, I think, in many ways, they're they're formulated wrongly in any case, and this is, they've received criticism on the gender pay gap and so on. But notwithstanding that, its effect would be to reinforce, like you say, effectively a liberal conception of society, and in fact to make society, capitalist society, function more authoritatively and legitimately on the basis of equity. I mean, that would be its political effect were it achieved. I suppose just the other element, though, that is the other element of it that I think is also important is in the 19th century, of course, it was a demand that was made by organized labor movements, by genuine kind of working class movements. Whereas today, obviously, it's formulated, these are essentially kind of PMC demands. They're not formulated through organized labor, or if they are, it's kind of white collar unions. But the expectation or the orientation of the claim, it's not channeled through organized labor, but it's also oriented towards essentially, human resources, bureaucracy, and also, to essentially the bosses, the oligarchs, and so on, that they need to reorganize their. I suppose anyway. What I'm getting at, I guess, is does this make any difference to your argument? So it's a very kind of erudite argument, and you weave through in great detail and with tremendous insight through the late 19th century classical period of Marxism. But the context in which justice claims are made today, material and post-material justice claims, is different from the critique that Marx and Engels were making of those kinds of claims in the late 19th century. So does that make any kind of difference to the kind of argument that you want to make, or do you think does it alter the kind of claims you might want to make?
I think the stakes were greater when Marx and Engels were formulating their critiques, as well as, figures like Luxemburg, Lafargue, and even, one could say even by the 70s, there was still traces of a more organized labor movement, perhaps having reconciled itself to the Fordist post-war consensus, but still, nevertheless, I think that the stakes were higher than the past couple decades. I'm not sure. I mean, again, to me, that's why, and I don't consider myself as breaking new ground here.
Yeah.
Really, I think I'm revisiting these past debates because they were posed at a higher pitch of class conflict, and with at a moment in which really history was still happening in a meaningful sense. I feel like I'm really just excavating the arguments of these thinkers. I think that really the point of raising this again today when demands for justice are being made by various civil society organizations, NGOs and whatnot, various liberals through different media outlets, is again to remind them that even the sort of language that they ape from the past, or like that they borrow from past labor movements, is language that, again, from a moment, when things really mattered quite a bit more, was itself inadequate even at the time. And it's all the more inadequate now when mostly symbolic demands for justice are being made. I think that perhaps its salience for today, in terms of just, whether or not one thinks of Marxism as a doctrine of social justice, is really, justice for Marx, again, was kind of an abstract moral category that, again, he saw as more a product of society than the basis for its critique, which he saw as more obeying sort of, necessary historical laws. It's, if one were to really talk about the ways in which leftist agitation takes place, even left liberal agitation takes place online or at protests or whatnot, it almost invariably takes the form of this kind of moral exhortation, which says, like, be outraged about this, like, be upset at the fact that this crying injustice is taking place.
Yeah. So on that specifically, you conclude very forcefully about this. So you say you conclude by arguing values like justice and morality, these are your words, strictly relative, shifting sands, conditioned by material circumstances, not stable grounds for Marxist politics. Now, I agree. I mean, I agree with the arguments you've made, as I hope is plain, and I agree with the thrust of your critique. But I do want to push you nonetheless, because I think I would maybe formulate my response slightly differently. And I want to push you in any case for the, just as devil's advocate. So it strikes me it's an odd note to end on, because when you say that there's stable grounds, that it doesn't offer stable grounds for Marxist politics, it's not clear to me that there are any stable grounds for Marxist politics at the moment in any case. Mm-hmm. At least, without any organized labor movement to speak of, and a deracinated and kind of defeated working class in the Western world. So that's one point. The second point, though, is it really possible to conceive of any popular working class movement that doesn't at least begin with an appeal to people's sense of indignation or dissatisfaction or frustration, or that sense of the burning passion for redress? In any kind of, ordinary workplace struggle, say the boss kind of stealing time, expectations placed on people in the workplace, wage theft, those kinds of sentiments are usually bundled together under the name of justice, or will be formulated in terms of justice, and will certainly kind of motivate people in a very basic and visceral way. So is it really possible to dispatch with the idea as decisively as you wish to in the piece?
That's a great question. For me, to answer the first part in terms of the sort of solid or stable ground on which the Marxist critique places itself, I think historically, and this is true even if the labor movement internationally and in the most advanced capitalist countries is at a low ebb, and at an historically low ebb in terms of militancy, in terms of its opposition to capitalism, it remains the standpoint of the proletariat as Marx understood it, as Lukács perhaps formulated in a bit more detail. It remains the consciousness of the fact that there is a way of reorganizing society in a way that gears production towards the provision of needs, the needs of humanity, and provides really the historical window onto a society that's founded on freedom and the capacities of human beings to sort of cultivate themselves freely. This remains the case even if the proletariat as presently constituted is just exploitable material for the valorization of capital. I think historically, in order for a working class movement to reconstitute itself, it would inevitably involve the creation of some sort of advanced guard, a vanguard, perhaps the political medium of the party. However unlikely this may seem at present, it remains the only possibility for a more humane society. And in terms of the second part of your question, would this inevitably be, or let me put that differently. In answering the second part of your question, would the organization of the class inevitably couch itself in terms of language of outrage, or saying of grievances, of saying wage theft, or the bosses are stealing from you? I think perhaps at the ideological level, these would remain in some sense spurs of politicization. That's perhaps what gets one interested in joining a larger movement. Again, I don't think that it is the foundation of Marxist critique. Marxist critique is not that capitalism is an unjust society, or that communism would be a more just society. Really, communism, as the bourgeois legal theorist Hans Kelsen realized, especially through his reading of Pachakanis and other Marxist theorists from the Soviet Union, jurists, is really a society beyond justice and a society of material abundance. It really isn't a question of who deserves what. One gets what one needs. And the grounds for achieving that historically are the necessity, first of all, the possibility of passing on to a higher stage of social organization, and the necessity of doing this, or else to relapse into barbarism, which I believe occurred 100 years ago. We've been living in it since. Basically, the fact that the capitalist society offers, perhaps preferable to past forms of organization, feudal forms, and other pre-capitalist forms of social organization, it no longer offers within itself any possibility for any progressive potential for human beings. I think that and Engels says this, he says as much. Well, it's not the basis. It might be a sort of weather vane for gauging the readiness of the masses to perhaps overthrow capitalism. Yeah, it's not the basis of Marxist critique, which is more an understanding of history and the laws of history as they conceive them.
Yeah, I mean, hearing you say that, and I don't disagree with any of it, but what's striking is that, today there's no sense that revolution is imminent. I mean, even if you saw it, it's decades away, in some sense that it will be happening soon. Then a lot of what you describe, or a lot of the kind of the sort of materialist case, loses its basis. I mean, so, the sort of supposedly, anti-ethical, which is perhaps, as you say in the essay, perhaps maybe not the best way to frame it, but this stance which doesn't concede anything to notions of justice, that's conceivable and possible if you live life in expectation of a new society. If not, and there's some sort of reconciliation to this society, then it's impossible, I guess, to have not to have recourse to some notion of justice, to eke out some improvements, to make life better, fairer, more free in the here and now. And I think that's, I don't know if this is necessarily a question, more maybe an observation, but I'm interested in your what you see, in your response to it, which is what is most remarkable in all of this is that there's no horizon of revolution, and how much then of that case that you've put forward collapses or has no real saliency without that horizon of revolution.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the confidence, the optimism of the generation of revolutionary Marxists that lived after Marx, perhaps even into the aftermath of the First World War, where they viewed world revolution, proletarian revolution as a certainty, as a veritable certainty that was just over the horizon. That's certainly been lost. And I think that perhaps some of my interest and sympathy, my interest in and sympathy for the Frankfurt School attests to the sort of pessimistic realization that this is not an inevitability. I think that the thing that's interesting, I think that makes, I think that gives rise to a kind of desperation on the parts of those people who, at least in terms of their self-conception, are pro-revolutionary, where they think, oh, well, the masses aren't just spontaneously organizing themselves against capitalism. How do we get them to do that? And the way that they do this in terms of like leftist publications and organs tends to be moral exhortation, as I've said, like basically saying, like, talking about various injustices around the world, saying like, how can we tolerate this? How can this, how can people stand to live under such unjust conditions? Thinking that, just the sheer outrage or the indignation on the part of the working class will just somehow spur them to action or organize them.
Yeah.
No, they've been doing this for decades.
Yeah, and it doesn't work. No, I agree. I agree with that. But I guess one answer to that, I mean, if it's somehow, I don't mean to necessarily urge that people abandon the possibility of revolution. Very much on the contrary. But I think wouldn't the answer then be to try to guarantee or to defend or advance freedom in the here and now in some sense? So maybe not appeal to some notion of justice or fairness to make society more equal, fair, whatever, but to expand the realm of freedom in the here and now, in the hope that might then open up further horizons. And you can frame that however you want, whether it's kind of labor struggles for higher wages, which guarantee greater freedom, or for universal healthcare, which might do likewise, or to defend bourgeois democracy. To, for example, I mean, with Brexit, for example, to defend, leaving the EU, because that guarantees or at least provides a basis for a greater democracy, if not necessarily a transcending of the horizon of bourgeois right. So, however you want to conceive of these different struggles, or defense of civil liberties today, however it might be, that these are struggles which don't necessarily point beyond justice, but they're not ones that necessarily hinge on justice either, and that would be where politics is to be found today.
Well, I would push back against the idea that there's a possibility for advancing really the Marxist notion of freedom, and the resolution of the various antinomies of freedom that history is bound up with in bourgeois society, within the bounds of bourgeois society. I think really the opening up of and the realization of freedom in its most rigorous sense, in its most robust sense, really only occurs through the dictatorship of the proletariat, through the abolition of classes. I don't think that seizing the reins of any bourgeois government and promoting various reforms really, perhaps it points in the direction of the eventual overcoming of these contradictions, but I don't think it's viable in any sense. I think that perhaps one could say that there is a real freedom that has been introduced by bourgeois society historically. This is Marx's entire point. It's one that's riven with contradictions, and that comes into conflict with itself, and cannot be resolved except through the self-assertion of the working class. It's something. Again, and perhaps this puts me at odds with like the sort of base building tendency. I think that the sort of desperation of intellectuals who are influenced by Marx and who think a better society is possible, or think a society based on a more profound Hegelian notion of freedom is possible, are dismayed by the sort of lack of organization of the working classes. I think I'm not saying that we should go among the masses and just preach this Hegelian doctrine of freedom, Hegelian Marxist doctrine of freedom. But I think that just appealing to their sort of sense of injustice is not an alternative to that. Just trying to mobilize them by saying like, we can't stand this any longer, or no justice, no peace, even any of these sort of like popular activist slogans. I don't think that they're really the way, the sort of moralizing rhetoric that really goes across the political spectrum from left to right, whatever side of any given, issue or policy position is. I think that really the Marxist critique poses itself at just a higher level than being for or against any number of these sort of policy positions that are the issues du jour. And while that doesn't mean that we should disengage from or just place ourselves at some artificial remove from what's going on in world politics, it does mean that we analyze them from a higher viewpoint, that we see them as part of a much broader historical process than the sort of presentism of the sort of daily outrage factory of the internet or just bourgeois media.
Absolutely. I think it's, on the one hand, obviously important to get beyond the outrage factory and not necessarily have a take or have a stance on every single issue. But I guess the challenge is, on the one hand, not to be drawn into that and not to reinforce or reify presentism, while at the same time not succumb to sort of political indifferentism. I don't know if you want.
Yeah, that's the challenge. It's the hardest. And it's the striking the balance there is all the more difficult given the lack of any sort of concrete movement. I think that the ability to sort of weigh in on issues of geopolitics or whatnot is made a lot easier when there is actually like an organized internationalist working class. In the absence of that, and perhaps this might appear to be a quietist mode of orienting oneself towards world politics, I think that one has to just remind oneself of the sort of really the higher political possibilities that existed in the past. And the idea is that really these aren't, while they may seem like, far-fetched from the standpoint of the present, they've not been totally eclipsed. The possibilities still exist. There still is, capitalism cannot exist absent a working class that sells its labor. Like capital cannot valorize itself without this exploitable mass. And as long as that mass continues to exist, absent the sort of end of the world or whatever, just total Armageddon, or just the relapse into even pre-capitalist barbarism, there is still the possibility that the proletarian masses can organize themselves politically and seize power on the global stage to transcend the sort of low stakes concerns of bourgeois policymaking or culture war posturing, on either side of the aisle.
All right, very good. I wanted to even ask you some other questions and talk about maybe anti-work and the Great Resignation, but maybe we'll have to have you on some other time to do that. And we'll have to.
Anton's probably the better person.
Oh yeah. Well, we're gonna have him back on as well. So obviously, this is part of a more long-standing, ongoing discussion on BungaCast. But anyway, thanks, Ross, very much. Listeners should check out the essay. It's linked here, especially if you're not very familiar with these sorts of debates. This provides brilliant. I was going to say brilliant introduction, but it's far more than just an introduction. But definitely worth checking out. So anyway,
thanks so much for giving me the opportunity to talk about it again. I'm not sure if it'll receive that much of a wider readership, but it is fairly esoteric in some of its references and whatnot. But I'm so glad to have been able to talk about it, and as fans of your work and the various guests you've had on, it's been great. So thank you so much.
Cheers,
Thanks
Ross.
very much, Ross.